Well, we're going to go ahead and get started because we did write a lot of material to cover today. Welcome to the USDA and FSA Program Basics training. This is the in part of a series that we've hosted this summer of virtual trainings for the pilot network. And my name is Margaret Krome-Lukens. I am the Policy Co-Director at RAFI. My co-presenter today is Stephen. Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Stephen Carpenter from Farmers Legal Action Group. Farmers Legal Action Group, FLAG, is a nonprofit law firm that works on behalf of family farmers.
Grateful to be working with you today. A couple housekeeping things before we get rolling. We are recording this session, so you can go back and listen to it if you need to. We will also be sharing the slides and all of the various diagrams we'll be looking at today afterwards. So that will all land in your inbox. We will also be doing a Q&A at the end. If we are able to catch your questions as we go, we'll try to get to them. But if not, we'll come back to questions that were left in the chat when we get to that Q&A part. This training, let's go ahead to the next slide. This training is happening in the context of the Distressed Borrowers Assistance Network, which is an FSA-funded project with the aim of helping farmers achieve long-term financial stability and health, and to strengthen the capacity of direct service providers, all of us, to help financially distressed farmers with really tailored assistance. And another purpose is to build a collaborative network where we can all learn from each other. A couple things that have happened with DBAN recently and that are going to happen. We launched this pilot network this spring, summer, of which this virtual training is a part. Also, the University of Arkansas, University of Minnesota, Alcorn State, and the 1890s Foundation have been working this spring and summer on requests for applications for funding. That process has been ongoing, and there was an orientation for folks in Texas last week. This fall, we are really looking forward to, I hope, seeing many of you in person at the training that we will be doing at Farm Aid on September 18th. And, also hopefully we'll see some of those RFA projects that are funded get rolling. So just wanted to kind of situate today in the other trainings that we have done and plan to do in the network. And you might have come to this training via the pilot network. You might have come to it via the DBAN RFA process. However you got here, we're glad you're here. Thanks for coming. Next slide. So today's training is a basic introduction to USDA. So if you are a seasoned direct service provider, there may not be a ton of new information for you here. Who knows? We'll find out. I know some of you are quite experienced direct service providers, but we wanted to be able to provide a roadmap for folks who are newer to the work to understand how USDA is structured, what the agencies do, what kinds of programs they offer and don't offer, and with a specific focus on farmer-facing agencies and especially FSA. We are going to touch a little bit on the history of how the department was established and is structured, including its agencies, and we will chat a bit about recent changes at USDA. Next slide. We have some things that are not our goals today. Important to set expectations for what is possible within an hour and a half. We will not be reviewing every single agency of USDA. We'll be skipping a lot of important work, but work that is maybe we encounter less as direct service providers for farmers in financial distress. We're not going to memorize the details of every single USDA program a farmer could apply for. There will be some links when you get the slides where you can find more information on them. And we're also not really going to get into procedure or options for if a farmer is turned down for a program, etc. So, with that said, I think we can switch to my screen share and one moment. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is a training that is focusing on USDA, but we also wanted to put USDA in context with other agencies out there that are relevant to farmers, but not a part of USDA, and just acknowledge that they operate on some different geographic scales. And when you put all of that together, it can be a little confusing for a farmer to know who is a part of what and who does what. So you can see here that we've got USDA in our green column. We're going to look much closer at that throughout the day here. And others in other columns. And we have the geographic scope noted here with national being at the top, state or territory next, and local or county level at the bottom. And we won't be giving you a quiz on this, but I've also included in our cloud-shaped bubbles here some things about who is leading those agencies and who picks those leaders, because that makes a difference. We're going to talk a lot about change and movement at USDA today, and that's important. Those are important mechanisms for us to understand. So starting with state departments of agriculture, they are not a part of USDA, though they have a relationship with USDA, but they're their own departments. And their leadership is either elected in a general election, like we do here in North Carolina, or appointed, often by the governor. They might receive funding via a block grant from USDA. They're their state government. There are also, in North Carolina, we call them soil and water conservation districts, which is a very common term for it, but conservation districts in most counties in the US. Those conservation districts are governed by locally elected boards. You probably, if you're in North Carolina, you've seen soil and water supervisor on your ballot before. And they provide technical assistance and education for local resource concerns. So that's another thing that it can be useful for a farmer to know about. Also related to USDA, kind of, but not really USDA, is the cooperative extension system. So cooperative extension exists to get agricultural resource that's happening at land-grant universities to local farmers. It is overseen by a USDA agency, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, but the system is a partnership between all of these folks, and they deliver research-based knowledge to farmers and ranchers and the public in general. Land grants offer, we're going to pause here for just a moment with land grants. They also offer a lot of other kinds of programs and tools, and one that comes up consistently in particularly credit access worth is something called enterprise budgets, where they basically have calculated the costs of production for specific crops in specific areas, and what you're going to get because of where the price of that crop is, if you have a good or medium or high yield. And that can be really important when you are backing up the numbers on a loan application. And those enterprise budgets are things that loan staff will reference regularly and can also provide some data if you don't have your own production history to provide to it. So mini rabbit hole, we'll zoom back out. Two agencies that are not a part of USDA, but they are federal agencies and farmers may want to know about them. The Small Business Administration is an independent agency, and with state and district offices, they do some lawmaking, and sometimes things happen like there's a global pandemic and there are economic relief programs like the Paycheck Protection Program. Farmers might be eligible for those programs as they were. And so in that situation, SBA was a relevant agency for them to know about. And they have in the past, their lending is focused towards small businesses. Those small businesses could be farm-related businesses, like a farmer's market, and contract poultry growers have also used SBA loans in the past. So, another agency to know about is FEMA. FEMA is currently situated within the Department of Homeland Security. It has moved around through the years. We'll talk a little bit more about the disaster assistance that USDA agencies can and cannot provide in disasters, but FEMA is the agency that is there for the immediate disaster response. Is an important disasters coming up these days, particularly in North Carolina, but also all over. So that's an important one to know about. Okay, we're gonna zoom back out and we're gonna go to USDA specific. Actually, I did that too soon. Sorry. USDA has a presence at all of these levels, right? There's national leadership, there's leadership at state offices, particularly the ones we're going to be talking about, FSA and NRCS. And those kinds of leadership are appointed by the president. We call them politicals. And if you are not a political appointee within the agency, you're career staff. So politicals will change with each presidential administration. Career staff will typically stay throughout different administrations. There's also some local decision making at the county level called county committees. Stephen, I think you're going to talk a little bit more about that part of things. That's the high level view of the different geographic scopes at which USDA operates. We'll get into the organization chart after Stephen has shared a little bit about the history of USDA and how it got that way. Yeah, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Margaret. So we wanted to talk just a couple of minutes about the background of USDA and as Margaret says, sort of how we got here. And I think that that history sort of is important for kind of really making sense of what USDA does in everyday life that that affects farmers. And so really the first thing to remember is that USDA was created during the Lincoln administration. So it goes back to the 1860s. That means it was there long before most other departments or agencies in the federal government. And it was always designed to assist farmers, but it has been a tricky task in some ways because USDA has mimicked its times. I mean, in the 1860s, USDA was a lot like the rest of the country in the 1860s. And as it developed further, some of those changes became increasing, those aspects became increasingly important for farmers. So by the 1920s, USDA is a lot larger. They are doing more and more things that directly benefit farmers. And by the 1930s, during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, you have a very significant expansion of USDA. So for the first time, USDA spends a lot of money on conservation programs, on programs that are designed to push prices up for farmers, also to increase the income of farmers. And at the same time, USDA begins to figure out that, hey, you got to have a national on the ground set of workers and a bureaucracy to actually implement these programs. You can't just do it from an office in DC. And so the answer to that question was to create very dispersed local offices. So there've been some consolidation, but for a long time there was essentially a USDA county office in every county in the United States, and that's thousands. And the idea was to have people on the ground that knew farmers' problems in the area and understood them. Also, at the same time, USDA did something which was intended in theory to democratize the local office. And so they created something called county committees, and those were elected by local farmers. So both the local employees and the county committees had an active role in deciding who benefited from the USDA programs. And that's important because, as we say is the case now, and really began in 1930s, the success of a farm could often really hinge on whether USDA programs were offered and offered fairly. So that sort of takes us a long way down the road. And so what we've just sort of described to the 1930s is something, that would look a lot like what USDA actually is now. The thing to remember as well, though, is that there has been some problems that USDA has had along the way. I mean, at times USDA has not been, frankly, very fair or responsive to everyday farmers, especially those that struggled. And there have been lawsuits that address that issue. Also, and more, I think, sort of relevant in terms of what gets discussed and where policies are moving now, is USDA, I think there's just no other way to say it, has had a very long history of discrimination. USDA has tended to support white men as farmers. People who are not white and women have not had the same success in using USDA resources for a very long time. And what you have now in the last few decades is sort of an increasing acknowledgement of that discrimination, as well as some efforts to try to get out in front of it by creating what we'll talk about more in a minute, socially disadvantaged applicant designation, which intended to help farmers of color and women. So as you get into the 1990s, there are lawsuits about this discrimination that you may well have heard about. They addressed actual discrimination against farmers, and more recently, you've had a discrimination financial assistance program at USDA that provided some direct help for farmers of color and women. And so that's sort of the background of USDA. We'll talk a little bit more about these SDA issues because they are really in play at the moment in terms of what the administration is trying to do and where political activism is. But to summarize, USDA started very long time ago, very small, and it's become a really important factor in the success of farmers. And it has relied on a very local bureaucracy, which has tended to mimic the political culture that surrounds it. So where a rural culture is pretty equal across the board, that's meant a pretty equal USDA. USDA has had a really big problem giving everyone opportunity in places where the surrounding society was also highly unequal. So with that, Margaret, I believe that's a super quick, hopefully, sense of the history. And at the end, we're happy to take questions and talk about whatever along these lines. So, Margaret, to you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to go back to my screen share. We're going to take a look at the USDA organizational chart, but quite a selective view because this is not all of it. I'm highlighting a few offices and mission areas. Actually, I've got all the mission areas in there, but highlighting a few offices and agencies, either that are more farmer facing and more relevant to a direct service provider's work, helping farmers with financial distress, or just there are a few that I'm highlighting because I think it's important that we understand the breadth of what USDA does. So the secretary's in charge. The deputy secretary is the number two in charge. And there are a number of assistant secretary offices. The one that we'll look at today is the assistant secretary for civil rights. They handle civil rights complaints. There's an official process, civil rights complaints, and they go here. It's important to know because there are some other time, if a farmer wants to contest, they got a no on an application or program decision, they can take that to the National Appeals Division. We're not going to get into the details there, but it is important to know that if a farmer feels that discrimination was a part of their adverse decision and they want to talk about discrimination in the appeal, National Appeals Division does not have jurisdiction on issues of discrimination. And so that's something that's important for direct service providers to know as well. USDA has an entire office full of lawyers. That's called the Office of General Counsel, or OGC. They also have an Office of the Inspector General, and that is meant to be basically USDA's internal accountability agency. There are a lot more offices, many of them with an administrative bent. Moving down to the boxes in green here, these are called mission areas. Mission areas of USDA are sort of like topic areas under which agencies fall, and every mission area has an undersecretary that oversees that group of agencies, or sometimes it's just the one agency. There are agencies that fall under these mission area umbrellas that are not here, but this is to give you an idea of the breadth that we mentioned. We'll be focusing today on the farm production and conservation mission area. Before we do, let's take a look. We've got rural development. Important to know that rural development is one of the loan making agencies that is relevant in rural areas. A lot of those loans focus on housing. Food and Nutrition Service, so SNAP, is run by USDA. Forest Service, if you are working with a farmer that is managing forest lands or timber, they're going to become relevant. Also, firefighting lives in Forest Service, which unfortunately is becoming increasingly relevant. Research, there's a mission area for research. I've flagged NIFA, which is the one that oversees cooperative extension, and ERS, which we may mention later. NIFA and ERS were relocated a few years ago with some instructive lessons about how that can go. Marketing and regulatory programs. The APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, those are the folks who are tracking bird flu, for example. Food safety and trade and foreign ag affairs. So USDA is paying attention to a lot of things. And the ones that most farmers are going to have interactions with kind of in a resources and funding way is going to be the ones under FPAC. Also worth noting that the mission areas are led by undersecretaries. Agencies or services here, the people in charge are called administrators or sometimes chiefs if it's an RCS, or directors. So if you see administrator of farm service agency, that is the person in charge of farm service agency. So let's jump in. Oh, actually, before we jump in to that, I'm curious if anybody wants to guess the top 3 USDA agencies that I have listed here in terms of number of staff. Feel free to unmute yourself or throw it in the chat. This is just to give us a sense of sort of agency size, and I'm realizing I now can't see the chat during my screen share, so if any of the facilitators see any comments, let me know. There's a chat.
There's a comment, FSIS. And there's another one, FSA, question mark. NRCS, FSA, AMS, FNS.
So many acronyms. Y'all got a couple of them. FSA and NRCS are two of them. They are not the top. The one with the most full-time equivalent staff, yes, Sarah, is Forest Service. They have, well, I will say these numbers are from 2024. They will probably look different when they're totaled up for 2025. In 2024, Forest Service had 33,000 staff. NRCS had over 12,000 and FSA had over 10,000. The total number for USDA, the entire department, was around 99,000. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of sort of where the most people are. You can see that with FSA and NRCS being really present locally, that takes a lot more folks. All right, let's dive in to FPAC. We are going to start with the Risk Management Agency. So we've got 3 agencies within the Farm Production and Conservation Mission area. The Risk Management Agency, NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and FSA, Farm Service Agency. Starting with the Risk Management Agency, they make crop insurance happen. They are not the ones who sell crop insurance policies. What they do is they back private insurers who sell those crop insurance policies to farmers. Crop insurance is crop specific. So you are going to buy a policy on 1,000 acres of corn or 2,000 acres of soy. You're not going to buy a policy on half an acre of diversified vegetable production. Unless you are going through Whole Farm Revenue Protection Program, we're not going to go into the details of that today, or through NAP, which does not live within Risk Management Agency, but here in farm programs at FSA. Those are the 2 kinds of risk management products that are available if you're not doing it on a crop by crop basis. Federal crop insurance, the premium costs are subsidized for farmers. And many loans and some programs may require crop insurance in order for the lender to be willing to lend. That's important when we're looking at credit access, because that means that a delay in your loan application that used to work out because you had crop insurance lined up may no longer work out if you get past the planting date where the local crop insurance agent is willing to sell you that policy. It's too late, doesn't think the crop is going to go. Now you can't get crop insurance. Now you can't get a loan. So when we're helping folks with loan applications, that's an important timeline to keep in mind. There are also some programs like the Emergency Conservation Program, which if you don't have crop insurance, when you get it, you have to sign a piece of paper saying, I will have it. And let's roll on to NRCS. Big picture, NRCS exists to help farmers and ranchers protect natural resources. There's a lot of conservation expertise in this agency. They provide technical assistance. They can help farmers with conservation plans. And in order to address natural resource concerns on a farm, there are cost share programs, there are conservation contracts. EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, are 2 that farmers may be the most familiar with. And one important thing to know about that is it's not the kind of program where if you have a good idea that's well thought out and you're eligible, you will get the money. Those are programs you apply for. Their applications are ranked. The top ones are chosen. Even a good application might not be funded that year or for several years. So that's an important thing to know. I think we'll leave NRCS there for the moment, though we are going to come back to it. And talk a little bit about FSA. Two major divisions within FSA. There's farm loan programs and there's farm programs. So the lending side and everything else, basically. In everything else, in farm programs, actually, let me back up a little bit. One of the very important functions of FSA is this kind of foundational paperwork. So to participate in most programs, you need a farm number. You also need acreage reports for a lot of programs. That is the kind of paperwork that you get done at FSA. FSA's price support programs. So those are the programs where you're growing a commodity, and if the price drops below a particular level, you get a check. Depending on a lot of things, it's complicated. We don't have time to go into it today, but this is basically what's known as commodity subsidies, living with farm programs. NAP, the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, that's one of the risk management tools that we talked about. Excuse me if you can hear the noise my dog is making. NAP is sort of, it can be used as an entry into other risk management tools like whole farm revenue. The payment rates are much lower, but it will get a farmer established in the kinds of paperwork that may set them up to have an easier time applying for other programs. And it is called non-insured crop disaster assistance because it will cover things that don't have a particular crop insurance based policy. So there are some other programs oriented around disaster assistance at FSA, like the Emergency Conservation Program, which addresses emergency resource concerns, like many of the ones that we saw with farmers we helped post Hurricane Helene. And there are other disaster assistance programs. They are usually built around a specific product that you're raising or a specific kind of disaster. One thing to know about disaster programs at FSA is that they are not for immediate disaster response. They all take more time than that. It's like a month or years timeline, depending on the program. And also, disaster response programs change all the time because for many disasters, there's not money for that particular disaster until Congress appropriates it, or because the agency is rethinking its approach to how they do disaster support. So I think talking about supporting farmers post-disaster is its own whole training. But the thing to know there is that it's worth looking into these programs, and for immediate needs, you might need to look at some other areas. I will also say emergency loans is part of your toolbox for disaster response. And in speaking to many farmers post-disaster, they would really rather a payment than a loan. Yeah. To talk a little bit about the link between FSA and NRCS, it's important to understand the relationship between the two agencies. So you're typically going to find them in the same office at your local USDA service center. There is a lot of exchange basically between the two agencies, but they don't do each other's work. And if a farmer doesn't understand that, it can be a frustrating visit at an agency when they go and the FSA person says, oh yeah, your step in the process is currently living at NRCS, and the farmer's like, well, can you just get it done? Like it's across the hall. And they're like, no. Um, so that's something to help farmers understand. Some examples of that are you go to FSA to apply for a farm number. Part of that process means filling out the 26 form for saying that you're not farming on wetlands or highly erodible land, and that form has to go to NRCS and come back. Or, for example, Emergency Conservation Program and Conservation Reserve Program are programs that are administered by FSA, but anytime that you are going to do something that is going to disturb soil, you'll need engineering approvals from NRCS. So knowing kind of who is in charge of what step is also important in terms of helping set a farmer's expectations. We're going to talk more about the farm loan program. It's really important to know the constellation of risk management and other potential resources a farmer can offer. Most of the farmers who call into our farmer hotline who are in crisis, it's going to be an issue of debt and access to credit, managing debt or accessing new credit, or both. And FSA has a really important role to play there. As we said, they're not the only lending agency within the federal government. SBA does loans for small businesses, rural development does loans, but this is the one that's the most focused on farming. In terms of the overall percentage of ag lending, it's a very small percentage overall, but it's a really important percentage because they are known as a quote, lender of last resort. What that means is that you are not even eligible for an FSA loan unless you cannot access credit at reasonable rates and terms at other lenders. And that is in place partly so that FSA is not competing with other lenders. It also means that FSA is the place that farmers land when they can't find credit elsewhere. FSA does tend to have good interest rates comparatively, and I've got a link in there. Again, these will all be sent out with slides with all of the links. And they update the interest rates, and you can check them out there. There are a bunch of different kinds of loans that FSA does. One of the first things to understand about distinctions between loans is what is a direct loan and what is a guaranteed loan. So a direct loan is a loan in which FSA themselves are the lender. You are borrowing directly from FSA. A guaranteed loan is a loan that FSA is basically dealing with the lender, and they are guaranteeing to the lender that if they give you a loan, FSA will guarantee up to 95% of the principal of that loan to basically, if the loan goes bad, they say, we've got you covered. And what that does ends up additional credit that lenders might not otherwise have been willing to extend to farmers because they're safer loans to give. So that is called a guaranteed loan. And the banks that participate in those programs are guaranteed lenders. Also worth knowing the word participating loans. So that is when part of your loan is from FSA and part of your loan is from a guaranteed lender. And what makes that possible is that FSA says to the guaranteed lender, if this loan goes bad, you get first dibs on all the farmer's assets. So it's actually an even better deal for guaranteed lenders. But that also is something that FSA will sometimes do to facilitate the overall goal of the farmer in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Loans can be for different things. Operating expenses, buying a farm, expanding your farm, working on the infrastructure of your farm. I mentioned emergency loans before. There are storage facility loans. There are microloans that are for a smaller amount, but there's less paperwork. And we're going to take a quick look at 4 of the most common kinds. So we talked about what is a guaranteed loan versus what is a direct loan, and operating and ownership loans are also sort of 2 different types. So we end up in this group of loans with 4 different types. One thing that is broadly true is that guaranteed loans have higher loan limits than direct loans do. So if your need is greater than the loan limit that you can get directly from FSA, your next step is probably to go to a guaranteed lender. Operating loans, they're typically 1 year. They're often annual operating loans, but they can be up to 7 years if you are getting longer term things. And then farm ownership loans, that's going to be more like something like a land purchase. Have a 40-year maximum term, $600,000 limit for direct loans, and both types of guaranteed loans. It's a little over 2 million. That's just, we've heard from farmers before who felt really hard done by the agency because they called and wanted a loan and were told that it wouldn't work out because of the loan limits. That is something that the agency will never be able to be flexible about. So you want to incorporate it into your plans and your assistance to farmers. Did want to mention, as we wrap up on this section, loan servicing. Loan servicing means that the words mean what a lender offers to a borrower when a borrower says, I don't think I'm going to be able to make these payments. You can make the loan term last for longer. In this sense, we're using the word term to say how long does the loan last. So you can extend the number of years on the loan and thereby lower the payment and make it more realistic for a farmer. You can set aside a payment for that year. There are a lot of options, specifically that FSA offers, and direct service providers can help farmers navigate those options. You do have to reply promptly if you're going to take advantage of many of those options or they go away. But there's a lot in the regulations for FSA borrowers related to loan servicing, and I think it is not just its own training, it is like its own week of training or more. But it is right at the heart of helping farmers who are in financial distress. So we will be offering more trainings on it. And I wanted to flag it here as something that's important to know is available at Farm Service Agency, and also wanted to note that a farmer's options within loan servicing can vary somewhat depending on what kind of a loan they get. There are different categories of guaranteed lenders, and the guaranteed lenders that do the most guaranteed loans are called preferred guaranteed lenders. And whereas the other categories of guaranteed lender are required to follow Farm Service Agency's procedures for loan servicing, preferred guaranteed lenders specifically can follow whatever they have written down in their lender agreement. And that may not be as protective as the opportunities for loan servicing within the Farm Service Agency. So it's important to know what kind of a guaranteed lender a farmer might be getting a loan from. If we're looking at what happens if that farmer gets into trouble. That is, I believe, the last of my charts. I will say that these also will be shared, and I guess I'll pause to see if there have been any questions in the chat so far. The next section is talking a little bit about the changes at USDA overall and recently as well. And I'm not seeing questions in the chat. Thank you, Mary. A little bit of context just to help understand some of the conversation that's about to happen. Part of the reason why things are the way they are is because of what Congress does and what USDA does. Congress passes the laws that authorize programs and funding, and they can be really variable about how much detail they put into those laws. They may be very prescriptive and say it's going to be like this, XYZ, and they may say, here is some money for this purpose. It will be up to the secretary to determine how to implement this. So there's a wide range there. But generally speaking, then USDA or other agencies of the executive branch or administration, they implement those laws and they write the rules that guide that implementation, and they write the handbooks that instruct the agency staff that the farmer is going to meet at the county level. Change is pretty much a constant at USDA. Every administration is going to want to do its own thing, basically. So, and you're going to see new programs happen every time Congress passes a farm bill. The funding cycle is annual, so that may change the availability of different programs. So things change all the time. And that's a hard thing for a farmer to track. So one thing direct service providers can do is stay current to help guide farmers through those changes, understand what they are and how they may be impacted. That said, we're going to talk about some of the changes that we've seen in 2025. So we can go to the next slide. I do want to say, if you're interested in the how and the why of all this works, Stephen is going to be doing sort of an ag civics presentation. And Stephen, you can say more about it if you want, but that will be one of the breakout sessions at the in-person training at Farm Aid. I will go ahead and roll into this for now. Some major themes here of changes at USDA, particularly in 2025 with the new administration. A number of events have impacted staffing levels at USDA. So probationary employees were fired around the beginning of the year. There was a lawsuit. Many of them were rehired. Those probationary employees were, some of them were new to the agency overall, and some of them were experienced career folks at the agency who were just in a new position in the probationary phase of that job. That was one of the first things that happened. They also offered the deferred resignation program to most USDA staff, also known as DRP, which basically said if you resign now, you can stay on payroll for several months into 2025, and but the offer is time limited. And as of late July, around 15,000 USDA employees had elected to take the DRP. So putting that in perspective again, 99,000-ish overall in 2024, USDA employees, around 15,000 of them taking DRP. There have also been lease terminations and office closures, all as a part of the, excuse me, DOJ's overall push to reduce spending. And we are still learning about where all those office closures will be, but for many farmers, it may mean driving longer to get to their USDA service center. And then, of course, we got big news in July with Secretary Rollins' memo, which I've got linked here if you want to read through it when you get the slides. That memo announced really a larger scale reorganization of USDA. USDA right now employs around 4,600 folks in the DC area. All that like national level things we saw on the top row, many or most of those are located in DC. The goal of the reorganization is to reduce that to 2,000. And they will do that by moving many of those functions from DC to 5 new regional offices. Giving staff the option to move to those offices. Those offices are going to be in Raleigh, North Carolina, Kansas City, Missouri, Indianapolis, Indiana, Fort Collins, Colorado, and Salt Lake City, Utah. They are also, and I will say that based on staff attrition when ERS and NIFA were relocated, we would expect that to happen as well with relocations to regional offices. They are also doing some consolidation of the regions used by various agencies to match those 5 regions. So if your agency did work based on 9 regions, those will be reorganized into the 5. And that includes NRCS. The other thing to know about that is that there are some Forest Service, all the Forest Service research stations will be consolidated into the one in Fort Collins. And I need to find the right page of my notes. The next one to talk about is federal funding. Many folks on this call may be aware of some of the changes, freezes and terminations that happened starting early in this year. And that's been many updates, many moving pieces with that, many lawsuits. And basically the administration froze funding for a large swath of federal grants and programs, pending review that those funds were meeting the administration's priorities. And they subsequently terminated a number of programs and grants. Initially, it wasn't clear whether those frozen funds were also going to freeze funds that farmers were counting on and planning their seasons on. For example, equip cost shares where the contract had already been signed. Farmers weren't sure if those were going to be dispersed. At this point, many of those grants have been funded. Broadly speaking, many of those types of actions are challenged in lawsuits, too many of them to summarize here, and legal fights take a long time. But in terms of impact on farmers, it's important to acknowledge and know that in some areas, programs that were helping farmers access USDA resources via technical assistance providers might not be funded, might be funded less, and that makes our work as direct service providers doubly important. Stephen is going to talk about the final rule that was published on July 10th about socially disadvantaged, the socially disadvantaged designation.
Thanks, Margaret. So we're now talking about a new regulation that was released by USDA on July 10th. And just to quickly recap of a little bit of what Margaret, as Margaret pointed out. So you have the Constitution, everything's got to be constitutional. Then you have Congress passing laws. Then you have departments like USDA carry out those laws. And along the way, they create rules and regulations. And some of those regulations fall under very strict rules about how those regulations are created. And so you have to give public access, you have to do drafts sometimes, and they at least have to all be public, and they are binding law. And then you have another layer that's a little murkier, which is sort of internal to a department, and that's it's handbooks, it's sort of everyday, how do we do this stuff, sorts of sets of rules. And that matters because what we're about to talk about right now is something that it fits into that scheme, but also is controversial and is a product in part of lawsuits and will be subject to further debate. And so what was issued on July 10th was a regulation. So it's one of these that has to be published in the Federal Register, which it was on July 10th. And it has the power of law. And so if USDA or somebody else, for that matter, was to violate this regulation, they would actually be in violation of the law. It's not so much that they would go to prison or anything like that, but you could sue them to enforce it. You could force the department, for example, to carry out this regulation. And the topic of the regulation, I won't even read the longish description, is, if you're familiar with USDA, concerns SDA programs or SDA parts of a program. SDA means socially disadvantaged under the sort of odd vocabulary of these regulations. And basically what we have here is a form of what people often call affirmative action. That is to say, you have certain groups of people who have experienced discrimination in the past. And so the government tries to create a program which gives those particular folks a bit of an advantage. And so at USDA, that's USDA is the sort of, again, the program, and SDA standing for socially disadvantaged applicant. And so if you just said it in one sentence, what the July 10th regulation does is pull back a number of the ways in which USDA programs favored socially disadvantaged applicants in some programs. And so it's actually, frankly, quite confusing. So we'll just talk actually first about what the regulation does and what it seems that they were trying to do. And when we'll talk about what its effect will be, we can mention some of the lawsuits that played a role here. So essentially, what USDA did was list a number of places in its own regulations where at present an SDA person, a social disadvantaged applicant, and here we mainly mean people of color, and in some places women, not, you can't, SDA doesn't always necessarily include women, but it's, race and ethnic categories that have in the past experienced discrimination. And it's worth noting that the programs themselves tended to give people a very minimal advantage. And so, I mean, you could go through and look at them one by one. And so in conservation programs, sometimes SDA gives you a little bit of a benefit on a calculation. In loan programs, there's a tiny priority to be able to buy inventory property from USDA. And in reality, there's very little inventory property. I mean, my guess is you're talking about a handful of transactions in a year. You also have some loan funds that are prioritized to go to SDA folks. In recent years, to my knowledge, there hasn't been anybody who did not get a loan because USDA ran out of money. At least that's been true in the years past. So I think that these SDA programs are real. They do things. I mean, they matter to people, but it's also not like anything that sort of completely turns USDA or its eligibility rules upside down. So what this regulation did was pull back on a number of those. And it's important to note that it did not affect all of them that are in the regulations. And so what it looks like USDA thought it was trying to do here was say that anywhere where there's not a legally binding regulation, in other words, where it was the handbooks or the other instructions, we're going to strip those out. And we're also going to go ahead and limit some of the what places where there were regulations, and we're going to change them. And so the question becomes, first of all, like, how big is the scope of this? And the reality is that some uses of SDA are still allowed and some are not. You kind of have to go through one by one and sort them out. It will be tempting, I'm afraid, for people to conclude that all SDA regulations are gone. I mean, there's a part of the explanation of this rule which seems to imply that's what they're doing, but it's not. So I fear that there's going to be some confusion as to what this rule did or did not do. If you want to contact me at Flag, trying to understand what really went down here in terms of the specifics, my email is in the chat. But to summarize, the regulations in many places were changed so that SDA priorities no longer apply. In some places, SDA provisions are in the federal statute. And so in those instances, USDA could not on its own roll those back. So those should remain untouched. So that's the quick summary. If you had to sort of put it in one sentence, you would say USDA, where it had the power to do, sought to limit use of SDA in its regulations for its farm programs. And as we look forward and backward, I'll say, this is not over. I mean, there will be more discussion about this. There will be more controversy. In the last couple of years, we've seen this build. The American Rescue Plan Act had a provision several years ago which would have helped certain farmers of color with their farm loans. People sued and said that violated the Constitution, and they won, and Congress repealed that provision. You also have a lawsuit called Strickland, which was decided in 2024, and it targeted a USDA conservation program in which the calculation of the conservation benefits hinged somewhat on whether or not you're an SDA applicant. And that case was also won by the farmer that sued, also ruling that this SDA program was unconstitutional. And the way USDA says that they understand the Strickland decision and these other decisions is that they now feel comfortable concluding that discrimination is no longer an issue at USDA, that this is all in the past. And further, at least some courts have said that a provision like SDA programs are themselves unconstitutional because they discriminate against the people that do not benefit from SDA. And so it goes without saying, I mean, that this is all very controversial stuff. There are a lot of people that believe that discrimination has not ended at USDA. I personally take that view, but other people disagree. And some of them are in the administration, and they're the ones that make the rules. And so that's what we have there. We're going to have continued discussion and probably lawsuits about the remaining SDA provisions. We could have lawsuits of people saying, hey, there's discrimination still going on, and so we're going to sue on that. That's all coming down the road. And if it feels like a lot of what's happening in race-based discussion and gender-based discussion with policy in the federal government is happening at USDA, you're right. I mean, there's a way in which affirmative action discussions kind of under the radar are really centered on USDA at the moment. So the question of what it means that USDA discriminated in the past, nobody denies that, or no person who cares to look at the record denies that. Whether you think that discrimination has ended, whether you think that there's any logic based on past discrimination or preventing future discrimination to have affirmative action type programs, all those things are in play, and they're going to be a part of the Farm Bill, and they're going to be part of lawsuits, and they'll be a part of the evolving way that USDA carries out its mission. So that's a long-winded and kind of obscure, I think, discussion of what on one hand just might be called a little Federal Register rules. If you ever want to spend some time, check out the Federal Register. This is issued in July, and it's already page 30,555. That's where this is stuck. It's page 30,000. But it's an important one, and that is a summary of the July 10th rule, and we'll be happy to talk about any questions you might have about that. Margaret, back to you.
Thanks. And a couple things that I meant to say earlier that forgot, just to let you know, regarding the reorganization of USDA, there is a comment period open through September 30th. That anybody can, it's not an official comment period in the Federal Register, but you can send an email with your comment, and they've extended that deadline a couple times, and it is now September 30th. Yeah, also wanted to just mention, like, we mentioned these changes at USDA partly because they will impact farmers if there are fewer staff in the agency. Applications may take longer to process. Farmers may experience staff transitions where an application that they had worked on with one staff was moving along and that staff is now no longer at the agency and they need to sort of find their feet again with a new person. We did mention that the folks may need to drive longer. And yeah, just kind of important to know that that is some of the context in which we are attempting to provide direct service to farmers. And as Stephen said, there will continue to be news about USDA, about USDA's implementation of programs, and it's important to keep an eye on it to know how it's going to impact folks. With that, I think we can end our recording and go into our Q&A session.